All right, well, welcome everyone that's getting logged on right now. We'll wait about 2 minutes. I think we'll have a few more people join us before we get started here. So we'll start according to my clock. We'll wait until 12:03 and go ahead and get started. So thanks for joining, and hopefully everyone can hear the sound okay. And we'll get started in 2 minutes. Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Jim Jansen. I'm one of the two hosts for today. Anastasia Meyer is a co-host. And she got pulled into helping out with a state FFA event here on East Campus. We're currently hosting the state of Nebraska state level farm Futures Farmers of America FFA convention. So I'll be taking the lead on her second half as well, but she did help develop the materials that we're presenting on the slides today. And also be aware that subject to when you signed up for today's meeting, if we were able to, we did send the handouts out. And if you signed up a little bit later, we'll be doing our final mailing of all handouts that you had received as part of our meeting today. That includes the slides. We put in a little evaluation to see if we can get some feedback on what you folks might think of the topics we're talking on, and also a return envelope. That really helps us out on our end. If you have a few minutes after our meeting's over today or after you view the recording, to please make that out, and we'll be sure to feed that back into our review process and see if we can make these programs better in the future. If you'd like to get a hold of me or Anastasia Meyer, be sure to check out our contact information, which is also on the slides. And the other thing I want to point out is on the bottom right-hand corner. Let me go back here for a second. I got to get my laser pointer pen. There we go. On the bottom right corner, there we go. You'll see that the slide numbers, there's a little red dot that's moving around. The slides are numbered. So if you're watching the recording or if you're watching live and you'd like to take some notes if you hadn't received the slides yet, be aware that the slides are numbered, and you can, hopefully that'll help you kind of follow along a little bit better. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. We had a grant from the North Central Extension Risk Management Education Center that helped prepare the materials for today, and also with the meeting logistics and mailing the handouts out to everyone. So we were grateful for that group for helping us out today. And we basically have a three-part presentation. First part, we're going to be taking a look at the current real estate markets across Nebraska, including the Nebraska land values and cash rents. Talk a little bit about agricultural flexible or flex lease arrangements and some of the trends surrounding them. Second part is Anastasia's material that I'll help cover. Will include current trends in leases and provisions, some considerations for succession and transition, And then the final part's kind of the new part for our meeting today. The final part we're going to be actually taking a look at on financial considerations related to farm and estate planning. Some of the things if you're someone that either stands to inherit something from someone, or if you're starting to think about your own estate to some degree, we're going to go over some common concerns or common financial considerations that some folks might be thinking about related to that. So with that, that'll be our three-part series for today. So we're going to start here on slide 4. And once again, all the slides are numbered. So if you're watching the recording or if you're watching this live, just be aware that you're more than welcome to kind of take notes if you don't have the handouts in front of you. And hopefully the slide numbering might help you out a little bit. And the other thing to keep in mind, we were asked by the legal folks here at the university just to report this, that the rates that we're going to be talking about on land values and cash rental rates, these are simply based on the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Nebraska Farm Real Estate Market Survey and Report. So please just be aware that they are averages and that the actual land values or cash rents may depend on the quality of the parcel land and any of the local market forces that guide your local real estate market. Okay, so now we're on to the materials. First thing to be aware of is that the University of Nebraska since 1978, I think this is the 47th year, if I'm not mistaken, that we have annually done the Nebraska Farm Market Real Estate Survey and Report. Each year we do two different things. We do what is called the preliminary estimates. They come out in the middle of March. And the final report includes all the preliminary estimate information, but it gives a lot of more, it updates the historic series related to land values and cash rents in the back end of the report. But it also takes a look at a little bit more deeper dive into some of the demographics or characteristics related to the farm real estate sales and additional information, things like capitalization rates, give a little bit more detail on the market value of land by quality grade. All of this information, you can do two different things. Please either visit the Center for Agricultural Profitability website at cap.unl.edu/real estate, or stop by if you're in the state of Nebraska. You can stop by and visit your local extension office, and many of them can usually run out a copy or two if you'd like. And Ryan Evans, our media specialist, I want to thank him for helping host this meeting today. He's slipping in a couple of helpful links in the chat pane as we're going along today. So please be aware that if you'd like to find the real estate website, you just click on that little pane right there, and you can actually take a look at it that way as well. So what we've done and what we will continue to do as part of the annual survey is we subdivide the state into 8 different regions. These 8 different regions are called Nebraska Agricultural Statistic Districts. And inside these districts, we have counties that are also called the crop reporting districts in these regions. But today we're going to be focusing a little bit more here on the eastern part of the state. Earlier in the week, we gave examples for the western part of the state. But in the eastern part of the state, you'll notice there's about 3 districts. Each of these districts share similar production attributes. So things like rainfall, typical growing length of the season. Southeast Nebraska has a more similar growing season than, say, the Northeast. And these are also the crop reporting districts, as we mentioned on the prior slide. And the information that the University of Nebraska summarizes is by region. And then we'll look at the USDA rates by county. And then towards the end of the first hour here, we'll be looking at some farm level examples that hopefully relate to some considerations you folks might be thinking through given the current circumstances that we have surrounding the Nebraska farm real estate markets or even real estate markets across the Central Plains here. Nebraska shares a lot of similarities with our neighbors in terms of the farther west you go in the state, it gets a little bit drier, the growing season's a little bit different, especially in the higher elevation areas, for example. Okay, so first thing, the Nebraska Farm Real Estate Survey, and we come up with what is called an all ag land value, which is an average across all the different types of cropland in addition to grazing land and hayland. And what you'll see is across certain areas of the state, you notice there's a slight increase. Well, some of these areas are the major ranching areas or the major rangeland, pasture, and hayland regions. So that includes the parts of the north, northwest, and central. Some of the areas that might be a little bit heavier in row crop production we noted a slight decline. A 1% decline is still fairly close to a steady market, but we did notice a slight decline in some of these regions. And overall, for the state of Nebraska this year, we're noting the second year decline since peaking in 2024. The prior year, we noted a 2% decline. This year, we're noting a 1% decline. If you take that average value, the average market value of land right here in the bottom left corner of this state chart, and put it on a slide, that's what we're going to see here on our next chart. So we have two things displayed here. People commonly ask many of us here at the university, what are two factors or features that are influencing the market value of land across Nebraska? Well, we've put in blue the Nebraska all land average value, and you'll note that $3,905 per acre is right here, and we're looking at the left axis for that. And the only crop that we grow in every county in this state, even out in the Sandhills, we may not grow a lot of it, but we do grow corn. And you'll notice the price of corn in here is in red. And there's kind of a cyclical nature related to the real estate market, at least on the commodity side of things. If you kind of look at this, and this is not adjusted for inflation, but there's clearly been two periods of time over about the last 15 years where we've noted exceptional drought or other factors or forces that have guided the market higher, and we're seeing those to be displayed here. So the question is, what is happening to real estate? Well, the value of what we have relates to what is legally and permissibly able to be done on that parcel of ground. If we dug into it a little bit deeper, we're not going to go specifically into the market value of grazing land, but what you'd notice is actually grazing land was up steady to slightly higher, and the value of cropland was steady to slightly lower. Well, that kind of relates to what we're seeing with some of the major trends related to cattle prices versus crop prices and some of the things that we have surrounding that. So one, the profitability of farming and ranching definitely has an influence on the current status of the market value of land. And once again, we estimate this always as of February 1 compared to the prior year. The other thing that you'll note is the average cost of borrowing. And on this slide, we use what is called the 10-year Treasury bond rate or the T-bill rate. The 10-year T-bill rate is a very active market that you can see traded on when the trade is open. And there's a very high volume of that. It's a very liquid market, a lot of traders. And I'm not suggesting we're financing farm real estate loans at say 4 or 4.5%. What I am suggesting, though, is this relates to long-term lending expenses. And if you want to go get a land loan, you'd probably be, maybe 2 to 2.5% higher than what we have listed here. But the one thing that weighs down on the market value of land beyond profitability is the cost of borrowing. And with the cost of borrowing that we note here, we had a very, very, very low interest rate in many farmland and housing loans as well, had a very favorable rate during the advent of COVID-19 and some of the after effects of that when the economy slowed down a little bit. And with that being said, we've seen things recover a little bit in the economy and recover in the ag economy too. And we've seen higher land values lead to that, higher market value of homes, whatever the asset value you might have. Now, one thing that has slowed down a little bit is the market value of land, and one thing that weighs down a little bit on the market value of land is the cost of long-term borrowing. Historically, this is still a very competitive rate, but say taking out a 30-year ag land loan, let's say at 6 or 6.5 or 7% compared to 3 or 3.5 or 4%, that change in the market interest rates definitely has a large impact or a factor or feature on the farm real estate markets. So that's something to be aware of. Now, this slide has not been updated for 2026, but I did note in the write-up based on the survey responses, what are the factors or features that are influencing the farm real estate markets? Well, some of the factors or features are what we call the economic forces across Nebraska. And what you notice on here, and based on our current survey analysis, some of the things that are weighing down on the farm real estate market are current crop prices. That's definitely a factor or feature that's weighing down on things. Other things that are weighing down on it include things such as The interest rates, input expenses, property taxes are something that we're actively debating every year in the unicameral, how to handle that matter. And the things that are actually improving the value, and probably the number one thing that was noted in the survey is current livestock prices. So that's kind of a breakdown that we see across Nebraska on what is impacting the farm real estate market across Nebraska. And I think this would carry forward for some of the other regions. But the biggest concerns, and probably some of the concerns if you're someone that rents cropland as well, are current crop prices, interest rates, and farm input expenses. Those are kind of the big three to be keeping an eye on here in 2026. And current livestock prices are definitely providing some degree of stability or some degree of competitiveness, whether for grazing land or hay land values or cash rents. So I expect to see a somewhat similar chart to 2026, and it'll be interesting to see when we get this all summarized what the summary pulls together. Now, on the topic of inputs, as we hinted at before, we asked the question, what are the big three factors or features that you see folks discussing? Well, some of the biggest things on the cropland side are the farm input expenses associated with lease arrangements. So what are the big three inputs? Seed, fertilizer, and chemicals. Now, this article we have right here came out of DTM, and I'm sure some of you are very well aware of what that is. The digital trading network, it's based in Omaha. And with the survey work that they do, or some of the summaries that they pull together, I guess it's maybe not necessarily a survey, but they kind of survey the market on pulling together some of their trends that they produce here. We have the average price of urea on the left, the average price of anhydrous on the right. 2026 is in red, 2025 is green, 2024 is in purple. What do you notice? Well, we're getting a lot closer to that historic seasonal trend that we're seeing for fertilizer prices. So that's something that's definitely true. And we're definitely trending higher than what we have. And you got to keep in mind these slides were put together before the current events that are occurring overseas were reported. So I would suspect that they're maybe even trending a little bit higher. But on the cropland side of the ledger, fertilizer prices are fairly steady to higher. Input expenses related to chemicals, it depends on what product you're using, but it seems like they're mostly steadied a little bit higher. Some of the generics might have a little bit better or more competitive pricing. And the prices for seed, so the type of seed corn or the soybean seed that's going to be planted here in the next month or month and a half, depending on where you're at, definitely also has an impact on some of the things that we're seeing related to input expenses. So tenants that are negotiating cash rents, if they haven't done it already, I'm sure they will be here shortly. They're trying to figure out what makes sense for cash rent given all these high input expenses. I'll hold on to that thought and we'll get to that here towards the end of the first hour here in about 20 or 25 minutes. But that's definitely a concern. And the other thing, I pulled this out of the Kansas City Federal Reserve. The Omaha branch office puts together various, one of their publications called the Ag Credit Survey, and you can go and find this link in the handout if you'd like to take a look at it. But with the Ag Credit Survey, what they did was they actually looked at fixed and variable interest rates for the major type of loans. And you'll notice that, interest rates are still above that 10 or 15-year average where they draw in that dotted line. And I might have drew the dotted line in, but it just goes to show you how low interest rates were from about 2010 to about 2021, 22 time period. Now, things have come back down a little bit. But the cost of borrowing, if you're someone that has a line of credit that needs to take a loan out, it has definitely influence the cost of things for like operating line of credits, machinery loans, real estate, whatever it might be. Unless you have additional profitability to offset that interest expense, it's definitely something that has the potential to possibly weigh down on the real estate markets to some degree. So the first part we've talked about here was kind of the current state of land values and cash rents and what are some of the major factors or features that are weighing down on the real estate market across Nebraska. And I would suspect somewhat similar trends in some of the neighboring states around Nebraska here in the Central Plains, just given the presence of cattle, current commodity prices for corn, soybeans, wheat, some of the major commodities raised here. Let's step through what does this mean for cash rents? So I think this is probably one of the more interesting things that many folks like to take a look at or kind of evaluate. So we'll go ahead and get started here. All right, so first thing, for the 2026 season, we're going to give you the average, we'll give you a range, then we're going to step through the USDA county level information, and then towards the end of these slides, we'll start working through how do you figure out a cash rent for 2026. Well, here we go. So the first thing to state, we're going to talk a little bit more on the eastern part of the state today. What do we notice? Well, when you start looking through these things, it seems to me many of the regions were down slightly. And here we go. I got my laser pointer again on my screen. But we noticed, say for example, the Northeast District was down 2, the Southeast was down 3, the East was down 6. Similar kinds of trends in the greater East or Western part of the state. But seems to me that markets on the cropland side of things have softened to some extent. And that's probably reflective of some of those, the big three expenses, seed, fertilizer, and chemical expenses relative to current commodity prices makes the margins a little bit tighter for some folks. And in addition to the average, we give the range here, which the range, you'll notice on the screen, it kind of goes by the acronym HAL. HAL stands for the average of the high grade, the overall average, and the average of the low grade. With the average of the high grade and low grade and the overall average, you notice that we have a pretty good spread across some of these regions. And one thing I want to point out when we talk about the low grade and the high grade, that's really the low third of cash rents and the high third of cash rents. So the people that take the survey, we ask them, what do you estimate the low third of cash rents is in your area, and what do you estimate the upper third or the high third of cash rents are in your area? And if you start in the southeast corner of the state, the extreme southeast corner, and move to the northwest corner, where you start at 34 to 30, around 34, 35 inches of rain. By the time you get up to Chadron, Nebraska, where Chadron State College is, for example, you're much closer to 10 to 12 inches. So for every 25 miles we move northwest in the state, we lose 1 inch of rain. And with that loss of rain, that definitely has some degree or some impact on the cash rents, and that's why we see some differences between the low third and the high third. What other things play a role in the cash rental rates? Well, the quality of the soil, the configuration of the property. Is it a nice square field? Is it a field cut up by a ditch or a ravine? All those factors or all those features can definitely have an impact or a role on some of the differences in the cash rents that we have reported here. So, and historically, we'll get some ideas, but if we could see a county breakdown, and we'll actually see this here in a few slides, the county breakdown can give us some ideas on how do those cash rental rates, these ranges, how do they relate to the county level information. Another source of cash rent information comes from the USDA. The USDA has a division called NASS. NASS stands for the National Agricultural Statistics Service. And with the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Survey, they do also do a survey on cash rents. They survey farmers. Their surveys, I think it's done a little bit later in the year than what the University of Nebraska does. But their information, you can either find it on their website, and we put together a little article this past fall where we took a look at the county level cash rents. And you'll see on the next slide here, we got a breakdown. And the USDA in recent years, it seems like they've been doing the cash rent surveys every year. I believe they're going to be doing it again here in 2026, but at least in 2025, we have information. And we're now on slide 18. And here on slide 18, if you do get the handouts or when you have the handouts, I know these numbers are a little bit harder to read. And hopefully you can see them on your end. But a few things to note. If you're in some of these counties that are in gray here, or even in the western part of the state, if the USDA does not get enough responses back, they do not publish a number because they don't have enough responses to publish a number with confidence. So that's one thing to note. And the other thing on here, and Ryan Evans has slipped in to the chat pane if you're following along there, the little website link. If you're taking notes, I'd suggest writing that down because you can go back and take a look at it. And also, I forgot to mention this. If you do get your handout, flip to the last 28, 29, and 30 in the back end of your handout. On page 28 will actually be this map, and it'll be a full size page from left to right, or the horizontal alignment, you might call it that way. But hopefully, you can gain some appreciation on how these cash rents vary. Let's pick on the Southeast District for a second. If we recall, the farther east you are in the state, the more rain you get. Well, it seems to me some of these counties here tend to align maybe with the upper third of cash rent a little bit closer than what, say, Knuckles or Thayer, maybe those more closely align with the lower third of cash rent. And the overall average, maybe Saline, Jefferson, and Gage, maybe they align with that average a little bit closer. Remember, this slide here gets updated in March every year. The USDA cash rent survey, from the information I've seen, this map, and now we did put the map together this year, but there is a USDA map out there as well. It was delayed a little bit. I think there was a federal shutdown at that time for a couple of weeks. And so there is that information out there as well. The USDA maps come roughly around harvest each year. It's not that it's bad information, but it does come a little bit later. What we can learn from this is it's kind of like a cookie cutter sheet in terms of, hey, what's the layout? How do things look like? And that's why we talk about that and look at that. And you can gain some appreciation to say, hey, let's look at the upper third of cash rents. Cumming County, Dakota County, I think was the highest at 293 versus Kimball County, I think might have been the lowest reported in 2026, and they had an average rate reported of $28 an acre. So wide variety of cash rents, that are impacted by many of the different factors or forces we've mentioned. Let me take a quick drink here. Okay, now let's step through the irrigated cash rents here for a little bit. The University of Nebraska reports on a gravity irrigated in addition to a center pivot irrigated cash rent. You'll notice here that we reported just a slight decline, about 2%. Some areas a little bit more, some areas a little bit less, but in the eastern part of the state, anywhere from that 2 to 4% range. And in addition to all the factors or features we mentioned on land, the quality of the soil, configuration of the field, how competitive it is, another thing that influences cash rents related to irrigated cropland comes to the water availability, water regulations in an area, and the overall quality of the water has some degree of factor or features that influences cash rental rates as well. Now, the breakdown here in the southeast to the east to the northeast, you see the low third average in the southeast down at 235, all the way up to the upper third average of about 375. So that gives us a pretty good range on the cash rents. And in addition, the center pivot irrigated rental rates, you'll notice they're down just slightly as well, 1 to 3% in the east, maybe a little bit more in the west. But the Northeast had just a very slight decline at 1%. In the East, you noticed, and the Southeast, at 335 to 325 or thereabouts. And we can see some changes on the cash rents there. And I'll spend a little bit more time here talking about the upper third, lower third, and overall average. You'll notice with the upper third, that once again, we call that the high grade, or what is the upper third or the high third of cash rent in an area. Low grade or low third is what is the lower third of cash rent in an area. And then the overall average that came in around 360 in the Northeast, East at 335, Southeast at 325. The thing you'll notice is that with the cash rental rates for center pivot irrigated cropland, they assume that the landowner owns the entire irrigation system. That includes the pivot, the pump, and the power unit. If the tenant provides one of those components, so the tenant would be responsible if they own the pivot or if they own the power unit or whatever it might be, we might discount the cash rent to reflect that. So we'll give you a couple adjustments here in a few slides on how to adjust that. The other thing to note, center pivot irrigated cash rental rates, they're usually 30, 40, maybe even $50 an acre more than what the gravity irrigated rental rates are, at $30 to $45, $35 to $45 range. So that's some of the ranges or some of the things that we've kind of noticed here. The USDA rental rates, you'll just excuse me. The USDA rental rates that we have reported here, these are actually on page 29 of the back of your handout. And on page 29, you'll notice some of the rates. You don't have a number published. So, if, for example, Platte County, do they have irrigated cropland? Yes, but they may not have enough numbers reported. That's why they didn't have a number or an estimate here. And also, the USDA rental rate does not segregate out or divide the center pivot from the gravity or the flood irrigated. They come up with a weighted average. So, say, for example, you're in Merritt County. Well, in Merritt County, you have a weighted average in the proportion of acres that are gravity or flood irrigated versus center pivot to arrive at this. So if a third of the acres in Merritt County are center pivot and two-thirds, if they were two-thirds flood irrigated, I don't think it's quite that high. The average that we have reported here is going to reflect that. And the USDA also assumes that the landowner owns the entire irrigation system. Once again, if the tenant provides one of the components, for example, if the tenant provided the pivot, so if you have a center pivot irrigated cash rental rate, let's say you wanted to get $350 an acre. Well, what this chart here from 2023 as part of our survey says is if the tenant provides the center pivot, the average cash rental rate might be discounted around that $26 to $50 an acre. So if, say, for example, we would take maybe $35 an acre off in the event that the tenant provides the pivot. So 350 subtracting off 35, we would end up at 315 an acre. And also the other major component would be the power unit. So say, for example, a diesel engine or something thereabouts, maybe even a natural gas engine. If the tenant provides one of those engines, we have, the biggest response on the diesel engine was $10 to $20 an acre. You would discount the cash rent. So let's just say it's $15. Remember, we wanted 315 acre, but the tenant provides the pivot, so they have to take care of it. They have to pay the insurance on it if they own it. So we are down to 35 off of 350. We end at 315. And then if you take off another $15, that would arrive at about $300 an acre in the event the tenant provides both the pivot and the power unit. We're adjusting the cash rent to reflect the contributions of both parties involved in it. Now on to the cow-calf pair rental rates. So let's talk on this briefly. There are many different ways to set grazing land cash rental rates. We can talk on a per acre, per animal unit, per month basis. The University of Nebraska and the USDA both report a per acre rental rate. And the University of Nebraska also reports on a cow-calf pair rental rate. On the cow-calf pair rental rate, that's on a monthly basis. Now you'll note that these rental rates that we have reported here, and compared to the cropland, it looks like they're steady to basically higher. In the eastern part of the state, you're talking anywhere up from 2 to 4% thereabouts. And in addition to the average, we have a range from the low grade to the high grade. What are the major considerations or things we think about related to grazing land on a per acre basis? Quality of the fencing, control of noxious weeds, water availability or who's providing the water, water quality too. Make sure if it's dry years, that water's safe for the livestock to drink. What else? What are the other considerations? Well, some of the other things to think about is who's going to be doing all that upkeep and maintenance. We always joke that it's always the other party, but really it's the person that has the time, ability, skill set, things of that nature. So that definitely influences these things. And the other question that comes up is who pays for the spray, the herbicide expense for the control of noxious weeds? We've always suggested if you have a great tenant that's willing to do it, try to incentivize that person. Maybe you say, hey, if we're going to spend $500 on spray this year on the herbicide, the actual drugs that you might buy at the inputs provider, maybe we do a cost share. Maybe the landlord pays for a portion of it, or maybe discounts the cash rent to some degree to account for the tenant and their willingness to help do some of these things. And I forgot to mention, if you have any questions as we're going along today, you can enter those either into the chat or the Q&A, and I'll try to answer those, kind of get after those as we're going along. But hopefully we're keeping the questions to a minimum if I'm explaining things well enough. The USDA rental rates, you'll notice in eastern Nebraska, there's a lot of counties in white or that light gray. If they're in the light gray or whitish color, they did not have enough numbers reported. And I know there is maybe not as much grazing land in the eastern part of the state, but yes, there's definitely grazing land. And if there's not enough information reported, you'll see that they put these counties in white because they can't produce a number with confidence. So hopefully next year we can see that a little bit better. And I believe in your handout, this should be your very last page. And what I tell you is hold on to this because maybe next year, here coming up in 6 months or so, if we get to see this updated survey for 2026 from the USDA, maybe we'll have a little bit better insight, but you might be able to find the 24 map and at least gain some appreciation on how those cash rents vary. And once again, looking at the southeast here, the farther east you move, you tend to get more in cash rent. Well, we kind of get that, see some of those things reported here accordingly to reflect that. On the cow-calf pair rental rates, this is for one cow, one calf for 1 month during the summer grazing season. And I'm well aware that unfortunately, and there's been in parts of western Nebraska that have sustained substantial fire damage or wildfires with the extreme wind and how dry it's been in some areas. And when it comes to setting up that lease and accounting for some of the things that we're seeing right now, I would stress trying to exert some degree of flexibility if you're a landlord on these topics. You got to figure out what is best for the ground. How do we get the land tenant through this process as well? It's not an easy question, but the cash rental rates that were reported here for 2026, if you wanted to rent for, let's say, 5 months, and let's just say you're in the East District, and instead of calling it 6920, let's just call it 70 for easy numbers. 70 times 5 would be approximately $350 a pair for the summer. So this is the breakdown on the per pair basis. And we also have this information on a per acre basis. And the university gives you a nice range across the eastern part of the state. On the per acre basis, you're probably going to be looking at things like the stocking rate might be a big component to it. I can tell you on the cow-calf pair rental rates that some of these higher numbers might reflect people that are, maybe they're not taking cattle in, but maybe they provide some degree of service or support as part of the lease arrangement. And we're seeing that bid into the cash rental rates. The other thing on grazing land is there's been very good cattle prices in the recent months or last 6 months or so. But we got to be setting cash rents that account for some of this uncertainty surrounding drought and fire, but also what might happen to cattle prices, say, come fall of 2026. When we start pulling calves off the pasture, if we would like to sell then, or maybe even around the first of the year, if you hold the calves until after the first of the year. But nonetheless, it's definitely a concern or something to be thinking about. And how we work through that or evaluate that is something we got to be hopefully working through or thinking about. So some folks, maybe we provide some degree of flex in that cash rental rate to account some of this uncertainty. Just something to think about. All right, so we've stepped through all the land values. Now we're briefly through the cash rents. I want to give some examples here on how do we figure out a cash rental rate here for 2026. I'm going to give two different ideas here. So with our first idea is called estimating the cash rental rate by adjusting regional or survey data. And for this example, let's say you have a cash rental rate of $190 an acre. And this is for the county, and the county corn yield was actually 145 bushel per acre. Maybe you looked up the yield over the last 2 or 3 years, did an average. Maybe you looked at the last 5 years and dropped the high, dropped the low, and average what's left. But you come up with an estimate on what a reasonable county corn yield might be. Dividing the two of those together, that gives us what is called the county rent per bushel. County rent per bushel right here, we're going to slide it to the upper right-hand corner. And when we slide it to the upper right-hand corner, that gives us the breakdown here on the right-hand side. And on this farm, my APH yield is a historic average associated with a crop. Let's just say the last 5 years, the APH was 130 bushel. I take the county rent per bushel times the APH yield. That gives us the farm level rent. So $1.31 a bushel times 130 bushel per acre. That gives us $170.34 an acre. We take what we know on the left and we step it down to what we may not be certain on the right. All right, so that's one idea on figuring out cash rents. And I want to step here. The second one, oh, I forgot to mention this. If you're looking for county level yields, where can I find this information? There's this big website link right here, and I should have it underlined. I'm sorry, I forgot to get that underlined. The 2025 crop yields are going to be available here. I'd guess we're about a little less than 2 months away from seeing it. For example, I give the example for the 24 crop yields when they were available in 25. If you go to this website, I would suggest using a Firefox internet browser. I've seen some issues using Google Chrome to open it. I'm not exactly sure why. If you get on this website, it's fairly easy to navigate. Notice there's these little drop-down boxes on the right-hand side. If these boxes aren't showing up, something's not quite right on the website. When they do show up, though, that's an indication that the website's working correctly, and it takes a little bit of time to step through it. But you can pull out different county yields. You can go back in time and look at county yields in the past. But this is a risk management agency website, so take a look at that if that'd be of interest to you. The other thing to keep in mind on the cash equivalent from crop shares, what this means is, can we take a crop share lease and make it into a cash lease? So here's the idea. Let's say we have a farm that yields 160 bushel per acre corn. This is an example to be thinking this through. If half the yield goes to the landowner and half the yield goes to the tenant, that means basically the landowner is getting half the crop revenue. Okay, so I just picked some numbers, maybe a little bit high for this fall, but that's what I used in the example. And I took half of the seed, fertilizer, chemical expenses, added 20% onto that. So I took a UNL crop budget and actually added 20% onto it. And the difference between the landlord share of the income minus their share of the expenses, this is what the landlord stands to make per acre using this crop share. You might think of this as the opportunity value on the ground. If I didn't do a crop share, I could always do a cash lease. Well, if you had a tenant offer a cash rental rate of, let's say, around $190 per acre, that definitely would be the next best thing to doing a crop share. And this is one way to kind of calibrate in that cash rent. Yes and no, there's expenses that I did not cover in this, and the reason I'm doing this is it's simply an example to be thinking through these things. Yes, the landowner has property tax expenses. Yes, the tenant has expenses associated with planting, harvesting, diesel, wear and equipment, their time. But this is kind of the example, the way I was taught or the way I think through these things. Now, the thing you'll notice is in this example, I keep everything steady, but I do allow the price of corn to vary. And, it comes down in July because let's say we're going to get rain and then it doesn't rain as much as we hope for and prices go back up. But this goes to show you cash rent really isn't a static thing. It's a thing that can change to some degree over time. So if you're struggling on setting a cash rental rate here for 2026, play the what if scenario, or the good, the bad, and the ugly scenario. What is the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? And then what's the most likely? Maybe that's one to figure out the cash rent or evaluate or estimate these things. And if you're someone that has a small hayfield, cash equivalent from hay share, in this example, this field yields 1.5 tons per acre. You could do a 1/3, 2/3 split or a 50-50 split. Under either case, if the landlord gets more of the hay, they have to pay for more of the expenses. So in this example, maybe you threw some fertilizer or spray out there, so the landowner is having to pay some of those expenses here on the right. At the end of the lease, you go back to the landowner and say, listen, why don't I just go back and buy out your share of the crop? If that's the case, or that's what you end up doing, the difference between the landlord's share of the income minus their share of the expenses or the opportunity value on the hay, the tenant could buy out the landlord's share of the hay. And then in lieu of doing this example I stepped through, if the landlord wants a cash rental rate per acre or per parcel of ground, can you work backwards? Think through these things. What do you think the price of hay is going to be this year? What do you think the yield's going to be? And that's how one way to kind of estimate that cash rent. Okay, so we stepped through land values. We stepped through the first hour, the part on cash rents. I want to briefly cover the topic of flexible cash leases. And I did have one question come in. And the question is, cash rents steadily reduce as you proceed from east to west. Okay, so this person is maybe referencing the USDA cash rental rate, mostly a function of precipitation. Why is the increase from the southeast to the northeast? So let's just go back a few slides. So maybe this individual was referencing maybe, let's go back here, jumping around. You don't stay on the slide that we were, but I just want to answer this question. So you're referencing why do we see some of these cash rents maybe going up a little bit farther north you go? That's a good question. Rainfall would maybe be one thing. Heat units, parts of southeast Nebraska might get a little bit more prone to drought. I can tell you living in the northeast part of the state versus knowing some folks in the extreme southern part of the state, certain days of the year, there's a 10-degree difference. If you're talking 90 degrees in southeast Nebraska, it might only be 80 degrees in northeast Nebraska. We see a little bit higher presence of livestock, cattle on feed in parts of the northeast and east districts. That can introduce a little bit more competitiveness to the area. Kind of hard to drill it down, but there's a variety of things that feed into it. Okay, so now we're going to step back to where we're supposed to be here. And when we get to the flexible cash leases, here we are. These are flexible cash leases for cropland here in 2026, given the uncertainty that we're having on prices and possibly yields. Many different ways to set up flexible cash leases. The best way to think of a flexible cash lease is if you take a cash lease and combine it with a crop share, we end up with a flex lease. A flexible lease is still a cash lease. That's an important thing to keep in mind. And been trying to work through some of these examples. We're going to be looking at the net change, and these three examples are percent change based on yield, price, and income will be three of our examples on how we set up a flexible cash lease arrangement. So the first thing we have to do is we have to figure out what is the starting point. The starting point in a flexible cash lease is called a base cash rental rate. Let's say a landlord wants to charge 230 an acre and the tenant works through the numbers and they say, you know what, 170 an acre makes the most sense. Maybe 170 an acre makes the most sense given current input expenses, current commodity prices. Maybe 230 an acre might be something to be thinking about from a landowner because they have high land ownership expenses, whatever the case might be. Well, if we have a range from 230 down to 170 that we're working in, if we put the two of those together, we could call those the base cash rent and do a simple average. So 230 plus 170 divided by 2, we come up with about $200 an acre. And what happens? If something good happens, something better than what we had hoped for, under that case, the base cash rent might go up possibly a little bit higher. We flex the cash rent a little bit higher. And when we flex the cash rent a little bit higher, we pay more cash rent up to 230. 230 is our maximum. And if things aren't as good as we'd hoped for, if we have a downfall in yield or price or a combination of those subject to how we set everything up, we might charge a little bit less in cash rent. So that's roughly the breakdown that we're seeing right here. And just to reiterate this example, we go from what we call our minimum or our floor on our cash rent up to our maximum or our ceiling. And our starting point is 200. And some of these examples we're going to be working through, we're going to stay in this range. Let's say we had a flex lease based on yield. And based on this yield, if we had only produced half the crop that we had hoped for, does that mean we only pay $100 an acre in cash rent? No. We default based on what we agreed to. And in this case, we're going to default to the minimum cash rent of approximately $170 an acre. Excuse me. Okay. Now, on the topic of flex leases, How do we set up what is called the installment or the payments that we're making? We can't ask for all the cash rent upfront day one when the lease is signed because we have to let that cash rent vary a little bit. But what does the landowner have to pay twice over the upcoming growing season? Well, in Nebraska, the answer is property taxes. So in this example, maybe we pay a half or a third of the cash rent up front. Maybe you do a second installment in the summer, but probably the second half might come sometime in the fall, there before the first of the year or whatever the agreement says. After harvest, we know what the crop yields are going to be, things like that. And in this example, we're going to let that cash rent vary. We might make a down payment. We might pay half of it up front in the spring, pay the remainder in the fall. And subject to what happens based on that flex we described here, that'll be what influences the final installment or the final payment on the cash rent. So let's look through an example here. So in my made up example, I think the cash rental rate should be about $200 an acre. And over the last 5 years, we have an average yield of 150 bushel. Okay, we're going to do a simple example. We're going to we're going to vary the rent based on the crop yield. So in this example, instead of raising 150 bushel, we only raise 135. The difference between these is about 10% lower than what we had hoped for. And we're going to take 10% times the base cash rent. So $200 times 10% gives us $20 an acre. 200 off of 20 gives us $180 an acre. In this example, we're letting the cash rent go lower. We're flexing it lower. We're letting the cash rent go a little bit lower based on the actual crop yield. Do we pay the 180? Yes, because it's more than 170. Now, if we only produced, let's say 100 bushel per acre, does that mean we're going to pay far less than 170 an acre? No. At that point, we're going to default to that. And this is an example where the cash rental rates are flexed lower. And on this example, we have a situation instead of raising 150 bushel, we're going to actually let the cash rents go a little bit higher. So instead of raising 150, we're actually going to raise 165 bushel, 15 bushel per acre higher than what we'd hoped for. 165 minus 150 divided by 150, that's 10% higher than we'd hoped for. 10% of 200 is $20 again. We're going to add that premium onto that base cash rent. Do we pay it? Yes, because it's lower than 230. Why 230? That's what we agreed to. Do we pay, let's say, for example, that we figured out it should come out to 250. Would we pay 250? No, we max it out at 230. So that's the breakdown we see on this. And I will encourage you, if you don't have the paper handout yet, just know that when you get the handout, I'd suggest grabbing a blank sheet of paper and working through those numbers to some degree. Or I think the handouts might be out online, or maybe you might receive some from Ryan Evans, our media specialist. I do think the easiest way to learn these things is you really have to sit down with a pencil and a piece of paper and try to work through these a little bit to gain some understanding on how the cash rental rates vary or how they vary based on the examples that we give. Now, here's an example. This is looking at crop price, and the next one's going to look at crop revenue. On the left-hand side, we have a situation where we're concerned about crop price, not crop yield so much. We have a situation where prices go up on the left, they come down on the right. In this example, you have a situation where you add a premium onto the cash rent, or we discount the cash rent based on some of these factors or forces that we're flexing on. And on the variable rent based on crop revenue, this is an example that incorporates just not price, but also incorporates crop yield. So we expect to have about $700 an acre in crop revenue. On the left-hand side, we have a situation where the yield's lower, but prices come up. On the right-hand side, we have a better yield, but prices are down. So we work through these examples, and we end up at 217 an acre on the left, or 194 on the right. It just goes to show you that because you have a good price doesn't mean you have a good yield, and just because you have a good yield doesn't mean you have a good price. There's a natural offset, and this is just for one farm, but nationally speaking, when we tend to see higher national yields, we tend to see a little bit higher, or maybe a little bit lower cash price or crop price. And if you have a little bit lower crop price, that might be indicative of a higher yield. So we went through three examples here. We are talking about variable flex lease price based on crop yield, crop price, and crop revenue. So if you do get these examples, if I even make you think a little bit differently about cash rent and how we pursue some of these things, that's good. It just is, I'm trying, Anastasia and I on these slides, we're trying to get across to you the uncertainty. And some people think a cash rent is a fixed number, and yes, it is a fixed number in your lease. But there's a lot of different things that are pulling cash rents in many different ways. And that's why we're seeing some of these things that we are here. Okay, so for the first hour today, and we're running just a little bit ahead of time, and that's just fine. We went over the current state of land values, cash rental rates, and some of the things surrounding farm lease arrangements related to flex leases. Second part here, we're going to be stepping through some basics on leases, some of the things Anastasia has put together to remind us about what are we need to be thinking on. So we're going to start here in crop share on that. And then the final piece that's really a new dimension to this workshop, we're going to be taking a look at what is occurring or what's going on with some of the critical financial considerations related to farm and ranch succession transition, kind of some of the vocabulary that if you're having to go see an attorney or a financial professional of various kinds, try to give you a little background on some of the things to be thinking about. So here's the basic idea on crop share lease arrangements. In a crop share, we are going to share the crop yield, typically. And depending on how much, what percent of the crop yield the landlord or the tenant takes, usually the landlord is going to start sharing in more and more of those expenses as they get a higher share of the crop. And Alan Banalik always suggested when he used to do these meetings with us that crop share was the most fair way. Some people use equitable. What I would get at is crop shares are a way to be dividing what's occurring on that ground, what's actually happening out there. And in a good year, the landlord gets rewarded. They get a little bit more of the crop yield. In a poor year or a tighter year, they get a little bit less. The tenant doesn't have to pay as much. So that's kind of the idea behind that. And when it comes to a crop share, remember, if you as a landowner would like to participate in various types of disaster payments, according to the federal statutes put out by the USDA, you must be an operator. Well, remember, a crop share is a situation where the division of any of the income is in proportion to the lease. Meaning if you're on a 50-50 crop share and there's a $50 an acre disaster payment made, half of it goes to the landlord, half of it goes to the tenant. It's divided in proportion to the lease on the income side of it. And then the expense side of it is based on whatever the landlord and the tenant both agree to. What are the most common types of crop shares across Nebraska? Well, Anastasia's been doing some survey work on this, and I think she might be putting out some things maybe this summer or fall based on what she's been seeing. But the most common types that we see are 40-60, 50-50, and 1/3, 2/3 crop shares. I think we tend to see a little bit more crop shares in the western part of the state, a little bit more cash leases on the eastern part of the state. Eastern part of the state, there's some comments made here, irrigated cropland on the east and central Nebraska, 50-50 might be a little bit more common. And that's based in proportion to the yield and also the expenses. Under 50-50 crop shares, you tend to see the big three: seed, fertilizer, chemicals, and also energy in the case of irrigation, so diesel or electricity or natural gas, whatever you're using to pump that water with. We usually see those get split down the middle as well. All right, we had a question come in on all these examples related to government subsidies. There's been various, trying to summarize here, so just give me a second. So the comment that was made basically is there's been different types of disaster payments being made. How do we calculate this in? Once again, Disaster payments are being made because of different things that are occurring. We had a severe decline in crop yield. Crop prices aren't as good as what we had hoped for. They're helping cash flow the cash rents, right? They're helping pay the different expenses associated with seed, fertilizer, chemicals, paying other expenses, crop insurance bill, your cash rent that's due. And if you're someone that wants to participate in these, once again, you have to be the operator. In the event of a crop share, the landlord and the tenant are both operators. So that's kind of the breakdown on that. And the different types of disaster payments probably has provided some degree of stability into the real estate markets, whether for land values or cash rents as well. So that's kind of how those things are factored in or accounted for. All right. Anastasia did a little bit of work here, and she was looking at about 17 responses and what percent of the time um, who shares in what. And well, you know what? We're talking a 50-50 cash lease, most of the time, there's most of a lot of the chemical expenses, fertilizer, that was a big one, and also the seed expense. It wasn't perfectly divided, but as I mentioned, half the seed, fertilizer, and chemical expenses are the big ones that are usually split 50-50. If you're someone that's in industry or someone that's participating in a share lease and you'd like to participate in her survey, reach out to her. I'm sure she'd be more than happy to send you a link or send you a physical survey, get some information on some of these things. And oh, I misspoke. You actually have the survey right here. So there's a little link on this website. And I'll tell you, even if you can't make out that much of that survey, any information that can provided will definitely help us out there. So please make out the survey to her, the link to her survey if that would apply to your situation. It definitely would help her. And Ryan Evans has slipped that link right there into the chat pane. So what are the expenses? How does a crop share work? Well, you know what? Landowners, you got to pay real estate taxes, whether you have a crop share or you have a cash lease. Usually the landowner is going to cover the major upgrades, improvements, operational expenses associated with the irrigation equipment, things like insurance, the depreciation, major repairs. Tenants, they're going to cover their labor. Sometimes they might cover some of the minor um, upkeep, maybe you have a flat tire that needs to get fixed or a couple nozzles need to get repaired on a pivot. Um, they might transport all of the grain produced off the property. That's a negotiable element. Landlord and tenants, definitely things that you do have to pay in proportion to the lease. Your share of the crop insurance. So if you're on a 50-50, the landlord and tenant will have the right, but not the requirement. More than likely, they will take out their share of the crop insurance. So if the landlord wants to have 85% revenue protection crop insurance, and the tenant wants to take out 75, that's definitely something they can do. And also the expenses associated with marketing their crop, that's usually another expense that they divide. Tenant usually takes care of their labor, use of their equipment on the property as well. Landowner can see the different expenses you might cover there as well. So what are some of the proper lease provisions in Nebraska? Well, a few things to keep in mind, and even if you're someone, I know we had somebody type into the chat pane that they were joining us today from Florida, so maybe they've retired to Florida. But in Nebraska, compared to South Dakota, Kansas, Iowa, Colorado, there are different laws and regulations that guide the use of verbal leases. So just be aware these are for Nebraska. If you have a verbal lease in Nebraska and you wish to make a change to it, so for 2027, if you want to change the cash rent or the provisions to the crop share, we need to let that other person know before September 1 if you wish to make any changes. So you have to terminate that lease and then you have to make the changes. Technically, if the landlord or the tenant does not terminate that verbal lease, the prior year's provisions actually carry forward. And what are the things that are good practices that we need to include in all leases, even beyond the verbal leases? Well, the starting and ending dates are you doing a 1 year lease, a 3 year lease, a 5 year lease? Any termination clauses? How many days before the end of the lease does the termination lease, does it have to be 6 months? Does it have to be 90 days, 30 days? What's the termination look like? If there a holdover clause, if you're doing a multi-year lease, are you going to renegotiate the cash rent every year? Is it steady across all the years? When is the cash rent payment due? Those are all really good provisions that we need to get in lease in writing. In Nebraska, remember, verbal handshake leases, we must give the termination 6 months prior to the end of the lease. On verbal lease notices, verbal leases run from March 1, so March 1, 2024 to February 28th, 2026. We're currently in the verbal lease, and a lot of written leases also run from March 1 of the current year. So March 1, 2026 to February 28th, or in the event of a leap year, February 29th of the following year, so February 28th, 2027. If you do not have a lease in writing, a well-written lease is for the protection of just not the landlord, but the tenant as well. And if you don't have a lease in writing, you can either see an attorney and have them get a lease together for you, or you check out aglease101.org. There are lease forms that an individual can get off this website, and they're kind of like filling the form PDF leases, or you could type on them, write on them if you want to print them off. They're a little bit longer, but they are a really good starting point that if you don't have anything in writing, I would highly encourage you to take a look at them. Now, what is the difference between verbal leases for cropland versus verbal leases for grazing land? There is a difference. In Nebraska, verbal leases for grazing land are typically considered to be a 5-month grazing land lease unless something is different is agreed to, which if you're in the ranching areas, maybe you may do off growing season. So we may do fall, winter, early spring growing season leases related to grazing. That's a little bit different deal. But technically in Nebraska, if you're on a 5-month verbal lease, you do not technically have to give termination notice. I would argue, for the sake of the livestock, that is a good practice to give a verbal lease termination, whether it's for cropland or grazing land, especially if you got livestock. You need to make different plans if you're going to go a different direction with someone else or whatever else. I think it's a really good practice to give notice for both parties involved. All right, so we had a question or a statement put in here. They commented about inflation and supply congestion and some of this. Cost of fertilized seed and fertilizer have all gone up with interest rates. Interest rates have maybe come down a little bit, but yes, all the major inputs are more expensive. So if the cash rents have gone down slightly, it appears cash rent is slightly. So the comment was made, we see that the cash rents are going down, but all the other inputs are maybe a little bit higher, going a little bit higher. So does that mean cash rents are necessarily subsidizing some of the other inputs? I wouldn't necessarily say they're subsidizing, and I would tell you that all the inputs have not uniformly gone up in expense. There have been individuals that have maybe prepaid some of the major inputs last fall and maybe are taking advantage of prices that are maybe not quite as high as what we're seeing. But it's definitely a dynamic that we're having to deal with right now is how do we figure out a margin given everything that's involved? Okay. So remember, verbal lease termination notices on cropland, we must give notices 6 months prior or prior to September 1st. And with that termination notice, we also need to take a look at getting, hopefully you could send that verbal lease termination notice in writing. And I think you have to send it certified mail if you really want to have proof, proof that it was delivered and the person signs off or acknowledges that they received the letter. So it's good to communicate with each parties involved if you have a lease and how we're going to deal on that. What are some other major considerations? Well, one thing to be thinking about right now is fertility. If you're dealing with a new tenant, one thing we've seen some folks do is there's a test, a soil fertility test that's administered at the start of the lease, come up with some basic guidelines on what was the fertility when that tenant entered the property, the new tenant. At the end of the lease, whether that's in a year, 3 years, 15 years, the tenant pays for kind of another fertility test to prove that, hey, at a base level, the base level of fertility is very similar at a minimum it is what it used to be when we first started this property. One reason we've seen people do this is they're concerned about fertility mining. They're using a greater degree of fertility than what they're actually providing on that property and then just leaving it. Well, if that's the case, or if that's a concern, this is kind of one way to avoid it. So, and if the fertility is less than what they initially started at the start of the lease, then we have to reestablish that fertility to bring it back up to that level. Typically, lime is a landowner expense. If the tenant does pay for that, we need to have a clause in the lease that, okay, if it costs $100 an acre to put lime out there, and let's say it's going to last 4 years, and the tenant has to vacate the property after 2 years, the landlord could reimburse the tenant for the unused portion. So if the lime is going to last 4 years and $100 an acre, well, that's fairly simple math. The tenant's going to pay for 50, landlord's going to pay for the other 50. So that's kind of the breakdown that we're seeing on that. Some of the other concerns we have, erosion. I don't know if erosion is going to be such a problem, erosion due to water this year, just given how dry it is, but I do think it happens. Fixing some of these major issues is usually a landowner expense unless the tenant did something that was not conducive to the lease arrangement. When we do have these big issues, if the tenant has the equipment to fix them, how might you address that in the lease? Maybe discount the rent over a year or a series of years to reflect the use of big, heavy diesel-powered equipment to fix that. Control of noxious cedar trees, noxious weeds, some of these other things to be thinking about. On the topic of cedar trees, they're not too bad to maintain if they've been maintained. If you have a property that you just see, boom, 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 with just a whole bunch of them, and the tenant has the equipment that can go out there and shred them or do things to disrupt them, what's that worth? Well, skid steers and shredding or shearing or pulling those trees out, that's definitely a pretty high expense. So that's definitely something to be thinking about on lease arrangements on how do we deal with that. If there's any other big considerations that you'd like employed on your property, just be aware you got to find a tenant that's willing to do those things. There's been interest in organic versus non-organic, no-till versus tillage. Just be sure you have an open conversation if there's anything certain that you'd like to handle things a certain way. Other lease provisions, something that we're having to deal with right now is that fire and drought. Hopefully we get adequate rain to have some of those fields start recovering. But just have lease provisions on grazing land that account for some of these different things. Hunting rights, the big thing with hunting rights, be aware that on grazing land, you may not have the rights to hunt that property if it's only a 5-month lease. And in Nebraska, we have what is called the Nebraska ecotourism law, which basically says is if you allow someone to go hunting on that property and an accident occurs, the landowner would not be held liable if they do not charge for the recreational activities, so hunting, fishing, horseback riding, riding four-wheelers, ATVs, whatever. If you do charge money and an accident occurs, the landowner could be held liable. So just be aware if you're doing these things, we need to have an insurance provision on our property insurance policy to ensure that we have coverage for that. Other things to consider, manure application, what does that look like if that's something the tenant wants to incorporate? The other thing is corn stalks. Corn stalk grazing is not a bad thing. We had a lot of good corn stalk grazing this winter, just given due to the lack of snowfall in certain areas. Removing all the material if you're going to bale corn stalks, that might be a year when we need to haul manure out there to offset some of that fertility lost due to corn stalk baling. Just be aware that doing corn stalk baling on the same field every year for the last 10 years is maybe not a desirable thing. We might rotate it. Grazing in corn stalks with cattle obviously have nutrient cycling with their waste from the animal. That's not quite such a big deal because you do leave some of that coverage still out on that field. But baling the corn stalks, when you bale everything off it consistently, you're losing some fertility. So maybe we haul manure out there. Maybe we might try doing some cover crops. But everything in moderation is a key thing. All right, now onto the irrigation equipment. What does that look like under a lease? Generally speaking, almost all the irrigation equipment usually belongs to the landowner. So it's not uncommon that the tenant helps maintain some of this. They might provide basic parts or their labor, their talent, and their ability. If the entire system is purchased by the tenant, then the rent would usually be adjusted lower to account for the tenant providing those things. Okay, so we're going to go on to the next slide here. What else to communicate? Well, anytime you have disaster, so like extreme flooding, extreme drought, hail, and you got a photo of a field that got hailed out right there. You have any diseases? You heard a lot this past fall about rust, southern rust making its way into especially cornfields. How do we communicate that to the landowner? Does that mean we need to print out a photo of what happened? Maybe some folks might take a picture of it, or they might have a drone they can fly over the field to demonstrate what happened out there. Just be aware that we have to have different ways to communicate that with the other parties involved. The other things, things related to extreme weed pressure. There are a lot of different types of weeds out there that are getting harder to control. I think there's some new chemistry coming into the market that might help control those things, but they definitely cost a lot. So we got to come up with proper things to control those. And what's the best way? What's the overall goal for the management of the property? And that's what we're after. We got to do what's best for the ground because that ground's going to last longer than anyone on this call will, right? Okay, so on to the next slide here. So the big things that we mentioned before, controlling, property maintenance related to dirt work. Some fields are terraced. What does that look like? Control noxious weeds, maintaining the fences, the irrigation system, what come up with mutually agreed upon solutions to dealing with some of these things. If you do not have a lease in writing, the website, another great thing to take a note here on slide 71 is aglease101.org. Aglease101.org. If you go onto that website, hit the document library. It's going to bring up two different columns. The left side columns are going to be kind of like educational pamphlets. The right-hand side are going to be actual lease forms that you can go in and sign. So the first part here, we went over some basic things surrounding leases. Let's get those leases in writing. It doesn't matter how old anyone is. A good lease is a written lease because it provides um, proof on what the agreement was. So now we're going to step through a little bit here into farm and ranch succession and transition and give everyone some basic ideas to be thinking over. And just be aware, we tried to put this together the most accurately as possible. Please refer to your legal, financial, taxation professional if you got specific questions. We're just trying to improve the knowledge of those people involved, whether you stand to inherit something or if you are someone that is going to bequest something to someone. So a few things to be thinking about here. I'll give you a second to take a look at this. All right. 98% of farms across the United States are family owned. 75% of active or retired farmers own 75, or excuse me, active operators and retired farmers own 75% or about three-fourths of the land in the United States. And of that, about half of those individuals do not have succession plan or transition plan, anything like that, or they're out of date. They may have had one early on in life, say when you had kids, but obviously a lot of things change as time progresses. And if you don't have a plan in place, your assets are still going to get dissipated over time. So who are you going to transfer these to, and what does that plan look like? Iowa, when they did their little survey on this, based on their survey back in 2019, majority of farmers either are never going to retire, maybe they would give up some of their rented land, they do kind of like a semi-retirement, but only, about 20% were ever going to completely retire. So that means about two out of every 10 or one out of every five were actually going to retire. And what are some of the reasons for the reasons on the ideas on why people are waiting till a later age to retire? Well, the biggest thing is People don't want to give up the control. You worked a lifetime on something or for something. Why do you want to give it up? Modern equipment, improvements in technology have made things a little bit easier. If we ever retire, that means we're going to have to give it up and face our ultimate mortality of our life. So that's something to be thinking about. And then they don't know what else they do, or they don't have a defined succession track. So those are kind of the big reasons on why we see a delay in retirement and some of those things. What is estate planning? Well, the basic idea behind estate planning is I highlighted on the slide here. I'm trying to think how to present this in a way. The reason many of us don't want to think about estate planning, so estate planning might incorporate will, a trust, some other things surrounding about that. Most of us don't think about that until something really bad happens. You have a health event, somebody has a heart attack. They can't physically do all the work anymore. COVID-19 kind of forced a lot of people to, regardless of their age, to think about their ultimate mortality. And let's be progressive on this topic in terms of let's make plans before something happens and not be regressive where we're having to start dissipating out some of the farm assets because of a health event. Somebody had a heart attack and they're no longer alive, and the other heir on the farm is having to sell some of these things off because they didn't have the knowledge or skill set or ability to do some of these things. What we have been seeing, one of our colleagues that's now retired put this little chart together here, is working with many farms and ranches across eastern Nebraska as well as the entire state. They came up with this wheel on how people evaluate farm succession. They might attend a meeting like you're seeing today, and they come up with the idea that says, well, you know what, I need to have a plan. So they maybe go to a meeting, maybe you meet with an attorney for an hour, maybe you go to there's different seminars you might attend, financial professionals put them on, and they'd say, you know what, this is really, really complicated. And then when people find complicated things, what do? They don't take any action. They put the notes from the meeting on the back shelf and they don't think about it. And then they kind of get into this circle. Well, our goal of our third section is actually this third piece right here, is to give you some better insight onto the basics surrounding some of these major considerations. And why don't we plan for transition? Some of us we're not really good planners. Mortality, we mentioned that before. And we're afraid if we don't do it completely perfect, that something else is going to go wrong. One thing I can guarantee you is having a plan that's maybe not the most up to date is better than having no plan at all. So that's just something to be thinking on. And what if we kind of put this into a dimension to be thinking about this is transition planning is never a never-ending process, because even the first day you take a paycheck at a business, you have to have a transition regardless if you're 13 or 83 years old. Why? Because you just never know what might happen. And so we have estate planning. So you go in and you get a will or trust together. As part of that estate planning, you have to have a business plan in place that, hey, okay, we're going to rent out part of the farm to the neighbor kid because that might be the person that's going to farm it, or a son or daughter, or whoever it might be. So that comes up with a succession plan. The succession plan is something that we evaluate or think on how do we move those assets over onto someone else's name, or how do we set that person up to get enough working capital so they can actually farm a ranch. It takes a lot of money to do those things. And usually you might see someone that does somewhat of a sunset plan. And sunset planning is, okay, maybe we're going to work with this next generation and do a crop share. And as time goes on, first, maybe I might take a small share and I get a little bit larger share. And as the tenant gets a bigger share on their end, we might see a situation where, say, for example, landlord and tenant start with a 50-50 crop share. And in 5 years, the landlord might get a third of the crop and pay none of the expenses, and the tenant might get two-thirds of the crop and pay for all the expenses. We see a kind of profitability, expenses, income, and that kind of thing down over time. So who's going to train that next generation of landowners? And that's a big thing to be thinking about if you're thinking about succession of onto a direct heir or neighbor, whoever it might be. So be sure to kind of get your act together. This is a little bit of a motivational talk. I don't care how much land you own, if you own a house, land, equipment, whatever the thing is, but come up with a plan. Step one is you got to write down what do you have. That might be assets, retirement accounts, vehicles, equipment, land holdings, buildings, the stuff in the buildings, whatever the case is. Step two is who's going to get those things? You're going to give it to certain people, but not other ones. How far down the line might that estate go? And then we get a kind of our plan together. And if you can get that basic plan together before you start seeking out legal and financial professionals, that'll save you time and because legal and financial professionals have to do a lot of homework trying to coach you through these first three steps before you actually get a will or a trust or whatever the thing might be. Well, if you can get steps 1 through 4 done, you actually get some things signed. You might get those things signed with an attorney or CPA, whoever it might be. And once you get these done, even if you're only 60 years old and you get all this stuff done, you just don't set it and forget it. You periodically have to keep updating this as situations change. Maybe your family situation doesn't change, but the state of Nebraska law is guiding whatever things might do change on estates or at the federal level. You see a lot of change at the federal level periodically, maybe every 3 to 5 years, different limits on things of that nature. So we got to be adapting to those things as things go on. What is the stress in succession planning? And this really is drilling down to it. A lot of emotions and dealing with family members. Those are probably the biggest things right there that drive some of these challenges that we face. So those are some of the things to be thinking about. We take a lot of calls with the extension service, and we usually don't get a ton of calls, people asking about, should I put my ground into a trust or a will or whatever. We see a lot of issues occurring around personal sibling animosity, harmony, whatever you might want to call it. If you're the matriarch or patriarch of this landholding or this estate, you got to let your plan be known now before all this other stuff happens. The reason I say that is you can cause a lot more issues when you're not here than when you are here. If you want things done a certain way, that's your business and that's fine. You just have to be thinking about how things might be divided, what's the ultimate impact those things might have on the success of the farm or ranch after you're gone. Some of the common assumptions that we have are, the kids are all getting along great now, so that's just going to continue. I can tell you things change after people are gone. And, this equal and fair thing, how things are divided. If you, let's say you have 3 or 4 kids and you're going to divide it equally 25, 25, 25, 25%, 25% 4 ways. If one of the kids is an on-farm individual, they might not have enough left after things are divided to make things work. They may not have enough cash on hand to buy out the other siblings or be in a position in their life that they could afford to do that. So think about all those things as we do these things. And this little chart here is the idea of equality versus equity. And the idea is subject to where someone might be in their professional pursuits. Sometimes kids leave the area and they do very well being in a different area of the United States or the world or whatever, versus as someone that stays back on the farm and is self-employed. They may not have quite as many opportunities. They may not have quite as many benefits to seeking off-farm employment. Like things like healthcare, monthly healthcare that's provided by your employer. So what's your ultimate goal? Is your goal to divide everything equally, or is your goal to divide things in a way that would allow one of the on-farm heirs to still continue the legacy of what's occurring there. That's what you have to be thinking about. All right, so we've stepped through the first two major parts. We're just going to kind of pull everything together here in the final series of slides, and I think we'll be done probably even here slightly before 2. And if you got questions, be sure to type those into the Q&A plane, and we'll hopefully address those as we're going along here. Many of us, when we are talking about someone's passing, someone's inheritance, one of the big things is taxes. Let's familiarize ourselves with some of the major taxes that surround estates and things like that. Well, at the federal level, we have the first thing is we have different thresholds related to the federal taxes on the topic of estates. Depending upon the year one's passing, there have been different laws passed, and there's been some changes under what we call the OB3, the One Big Beautiful Bill. And subject to when someone passed, there's been some changes made. And surrounding these changes, you can see if you're a married couple versus a single individual. And I would say for most farming operations, based on the amount of land a lot of people own, starting here in 2026 with the step up in that increase, substantially different than 2017. That number that you see right here would capture most of the states. But that's a federal exemption limits on some of that. The other thing is in each year, in addition to these limits you see at the federal level, you can gift someone, doesn't matter who it is, it can be a child, it can be a son and daughter-in-law, or whatever the case might be, up to $19,000 in cash or equivalent assets. We've seen some folks use this gifting as a way to gift a portion of their, so maybe they might give some cash or some of the equipment every year, and you can't gift about $40,000 worth of equipment in just 1 year. That's fairly small net, but if you do it over time, you might be able to move some of that equipment of the operation onto someone else's name. And there's many different ways to transition things, but the big take home are with the federal estate tax exemptions, they've been made permanent now, so that's a good thing. We've established where that's at, and they're also going to be adjusted annually for inflation. And there are some basic gifting exemptions where someone can gift to someone else different things like cash or cash equivalents through the form of machinery, livestock, whatever the case might be. One thing that we talk about a lot on the topic of properties is the step up in basis. And the step up in basis relates to this idea of what we call capital gains tax. And why you see so many people when they inherit something sell a property fairly short after someone's passing, just not, the year or two before someone passes, is because we have that step up in basis. So say, for example, if someone purchased a parcel of ground for $500 an acre, and then they end up selling it for $9,500 an acre. If the original person that bought that ground sold it for $9,500 an acre, the basis on that property was initially $500. They'd have a $9,000 capital gains that they'd be subject to based on current capital gains tax laws. Well, when someone inherits that from someone else, if a child inherits it from their parents, or children inherit it from their parents, they have a step up in the basis. The basis is not 500. The land was valued at 9,500. The basis would be 9,500. Kids chose to sell the ground, say a year or two later, and they end up selling it for 10,000 an acre. They're not going to be paying capital gains on the difference between 10,000 to 500. They're actually paying the difference between what they inherited it at versus what they sold it for, which would, 500 an acre is far less to pay capital gains on than 9,000. And there's different types of capital gains relating to the short term versus long term and length of ownership. When we have someone that passes away, we need to value their assets. One of the most common ways to do this, I consider to be one of the most important ways, or one of the more accurate ways to do this, is taking a look at getting an appraisal done to value just not the land, but the state of the improvements, and truly get a good snapshot on what was that asset worth. And depending on how things are owned, people have tried different things over the years, but I can tell you, if you get a third-party opinion of value, yes, it will cost some money to get it done, but that's a really good way to gain some understanding on what do you have out there and what is it truly worth. And also, if you're a spouse of someone, there's stepped up in basis for their portion of the asset that their former spouse owned if they passed away. A lot of little things here, but we just want to introduce the topic of the step up in basis. So here's kind of an example. You got an individual bought some ground in 1970 for 500 an acre. This individual passes away, heirs inherit it, and they sold the land. Let's say they sold it for 7,000, exactly what they inherited to that. They're not subject to capital gains. We have another situation here. If mom sold the ground, or dad, doesn't matter who it is, they had to sell some of the ground because of long-term care expenses with things like the nursing home or long-term care assisted living. They would be subject to the difference between what is valued at versus at capital gains. Capital gains with respect to the current sale price. So just be aware that death is obviously a very hard thing for people to comprehend, especially depending on who passed away. But the big thing is that that step up in the capital gains, the step up in the basis, and the impact that it can have. Capital gains laws can change over time depending on who the president and controlling House and Senate. And there's been various proposals in the last every presidential cycle. You see various proposals surrounding capital gains tax and income tax and whatever the cases are. So this is just kind of one of those dimensions you got to stay up to date on related to that farm or ranch estate. In Nebraska, we're one of the states that have what it's called inheritance tax. Inheritance tax is kind of a local tax. I believe most of the money stays at the county level. And depending on who you are in relation to the person you're inheriting it from has an influence on how much of the inheritance tax you have to pay. And so here's some examples. If you're a direct or close relative versus someone that's further away or even further away. So if you're a direct child or a sibling or a parent or grandparent, the asset value is exempt up to 100,000. Anything that exceeds 100,000, pay 1% inheritance and tax on. Now, if you're kind of a generation out, aunt, uncle, niece or nephews, other than direct descendants or direct bloodline, the exemption is a little bit less, and you pay 11%. And then if you're just, a neighbor down the road that inherited that farm from someone or something, capital gain or the inheritance tax in this case would be 15%. I think these are actually have been revised by the unicameral in the last couple of years, but just be aware that these rates depend on who you're dealing with. And this is with respect to real property held in Nebraska. One thing that you see some folks do, let's say you grew up in Iowa, moved to Nebraska, maybe got married or something. Folks have some ground out in Iowa that you choose to sell and you want to buy some ground back in Nebraska. Okay, that's fine. What you can do is if you inherited some ground in Iowa, this has to be done under a fairly tight time range. I don't know the exact time range, but it's maybe even less than 6 months. You can sell land in Iowa, buy ground in Nebraska as long as it's worth $1 more than what that Iowa ground was. And you can take the capital, the equity, what you own in that Iowa ground, and move it over here, and you're not even triggering inheritance tax, you're not triggering income tax, capital gains tax, you're moving value from one income producing asset to another one. I think you can do this with a home too. Say you inherited your folks' home up in Minneapolis and you want to buy a house in Lincoln. I think you can do a 1031 tax exchange for that too. It's what we refer to as like-kind exchanged assets. And there are some rules here that you'll see on this slide. from when you initially identify a potential property, you have to have the purchase agreement in writing. And then you have to have that replacement property. You have to get that lined up so many days after that. Um, if you do this, there's guidance on the IRS website from when you sell to when you buy. You almost have to have some ideas in mind or some, working with someone else fairly close before you considering these things. This, if you are someone that is looking to rent land out to someone and you don't have a good person lined up, or if you're someone that's looking to rent land from someone, a Craigslist or a wanted ad almost deal. If you're someone that's looking to rent land, or if you're someone that would like to offer land up to rent to someone, it's a good resource to maybe take a look at some of that. Another project funded by the North Central Extension Risk Management Education Center. A few more things that we're going to be taking a look at here, just on the topic of finances related to land. If you own land in Nebraska and you file a state of Nebraska income tax return, there's a deal that's called the property tax credit rebate. It's a rebate on a portion of the real estate taxes paid to your local community college that can actually get refunded to you as a state of Nebraska income tax credit. You may recall in the last year or two in the summertime, they had a special session where we used to make out a separate income tax credit for the portion of real estate taxes that went towards your local K through 12 institution. Well, now there's a tax credit that actually shows up in your annual assessment that appears in the fall. There is still a credit that exists for your local community college. This community college credit, you have to make out a separate form when you do your state of Nebraska taxes. It's a fairly small percent, maybe, 1, 2, 3% of your overall tax burden, but just be aware to make that out. So that's one thing that can help reduce your tax burden that you owe on your real estate taxes. On the topic of state of Nebraska income taxes, another tool that's out there is called the Beginning Farmer Tax Credit Program. How this works is if you're a beginning farmer, the beginning farmer is someone I believe that has farmed for less than 10 years, according to by filing the federal 1040-F income tax form for less than 10 years. The property owner gets a small portion of the rent back. So let's say you're charging, I don't know, pick a number. Let's say you charge $300 an acre for on irrigated cropland for cash rent. You actually get 10% of 300 is $30 an acre comes back to the landowner as a property tax credit, or 15% of the share rent. And with this tax credit, if you want to be participating in this, and Anastasia has this little thing you can scan here, you have to make out a special application prior to November 1 if you wish to be making this out. So you would have had to make the application out prior to November 1, 2025 for the 2026 growing season. So this is about the time now you got to be making these forms out. And there's a series of forms you have to make out if you want to capture this credit in 2027. There's some examples on the numbers here on how the credit works. Say, for example, you have 100 acres, you get $300 an acre cash rent, total $30,000 in cash rent. Well, you take 10% of 30,000 and 3,000 a year. You could renew this credit for up to 3 years. So that's a tax credit. Remember, if you don't owe any property or owe any income tax in Nebraska, the state will actually send you a check. The share crop rent, we can see the breakdown here. You use 15% of the overall value, which is even a little bit more than what cash rent credit might be. You can even do this on a cow-calf share, figuring out the credit on that. So just be aware if you want to do this, we got to make an application out. And there's some other restrictions here. You have to farm less, for less than 10 of the last 15 years. You have to have a net worth of less than a certain amount. Must be a resident of Nebraska. The tenant ownership, you have to own the land. And there's some other things about trying to get this land moved on to someone else's name. You might have to attend even a short seminar. We're towards the end of we're going to be getting done a little bit early today. So if you have any questions, be sure to type them into the chat or the Q&A pane. And I got those both open right now. So be sure to type those in here. If you like the webinar that we're attending, and Anastasia, I covered her material maybe a little bit faster than she might have by herself, or if she had been going over those materials. We have what is called Ag Land Management Quarterly. It's a quarterly webinar, kind of a reduced version of what we covered today. We covered a lot of ground today, but once each business quarter each year, so we do it 4 times a year. We have different topics, and it's probably going to be a little bit of review on what we covered today. But if you'd like to attend Land Management Quarterly, just be aware that the workshops are available to the general public on the Center for Ag Profitability website. And our next one with the outline. And we also allow, if you submit questions before the meeting, we actually publish or come up with a short response over a slide or two trying to answer your question. I want to thank Farmers National Company. Farmers National Company, we did probably in excess of 10 in-person meetings. And Farmers National Company sponsored various types of refreshments and food, and they also help provide financial support for today's meeting and things like that. So we greatly thank them and their employees for helping us out with sponsoring a light meal or refreshments. So we thank them for their helping out this. And if you're a company that'd like to help us out in the future, reach out to us. We're always looking to partner with companies from across Nebraska. And once again, my name is Jim Jansen. Anastasia Meyer was the co-author of today's presentation, who is helping out with the state FFA competition on campus today. So we thank her for helping do that as well. But basically, the first half material that I prepared, she prepared the second half. And if you got questions or concerns, be aware that our contact information is listed here. And please, if you received the handouts in mail, just know that there is a short survey that you could return that will help us out a lot. And also, if you haven't gotten your mailings in the mail, if you registered a little bit late, just know that we're going to do one mailing. I think they're actually going to maybe put the stuff together next Monday or Tuesday, and they'll get everything out in the mail then. And the mail sometimes takes a little bit longer to get to you where it needs to be going. So please bear with it. But thanks for everyone that attended. And I'm not seeing any other questions pop open here, but we'll just hang on for a few minutes here. And I know still got a few people on our call, but thanks for those that attended today's meeting. And hopefully, I know it gets kind of long listening to one person talk the entire time. So yesterday we went a little over 2 hours, but we had 2 presenters, so that worked out pretty nice. Or Tuesday when we did our presentation. So, all right. Well, had a nice group join us today. And all right. Well, I'm not seeing a few people expressing appreciation for the meeting. We really appreciated you joining today. So I am not seeing any other comments with that. I think we're going to go ahead and stop the share and stop the recording. And we appreciate everyone for joining us today. So please stay engaged and look for our future meetings. Attend any of them that you might like in the future. Take care, everyone.